Our Plant Stories has been nominated as a finalist in the Independent Podcast Awards in a new category called Environment and Natural World. I'll let you know how we get on. Thanks to all those who are regular supporters of the podcast with their commitment to buying a monthly coffee. And to Anne, who also sent some caffeine my way this month, all of which goes towards paying for this podcast, the hosting platform and the editing programme. The link is in the show notes. And now, a plant story. Welcome to Our Plant Stories. And we're going to be talking celebrity gardeners, circa 1850s.
They needed a few celebrity gardeners, as we all do today. Who doesn't need an Alan Titchmarsh when you're in need of getting, trying to get people to give money to your gardening charity? We all love Alan. But in those days, they would love Joseph Paxton.
We've got an offshoot episode taking us back almost 200 years and gardeners setting up a fund to provide pensions to gardeners. In this month's plant story, Mona's Corokia, we heard that Mona Abood is leaving her North London garden full of New Zealand native plants and a national collection of Corokias to the charity Perennial, a UK charity dedicated to looking after people working in horticulture and their families at any stage of life. The roots of this charity go back almost 200 years, and garden historian Francesca Murray is currently doing her PhD on the forerunner of Perennial, the Gardeners' Royal Benevolent Institution. For this offshoot episode, Francesca tells the story of the gardeners who began this fund, and it involves a large gathering of horticulturalists and a garden journalist.
Yeah, when Perennial was actually born, or Gardeners' Benevolent was born in around 1830, the 1830s, there is this rather naughty and mouthy journalist who is a bit of a troublemaker, and whistleblowers often are troublemakers. We need whistleblowers in this society to say, hang on a minute, these gardeners need some help. And he wrote a journal called the Gardener's Gazette, which was always quite argumentative, but it was a contrast to J.C. Loudon. And J.C. Loudon was the sort of respectable garden journalist who wrote about the estates and the villas and how it should be, everything should be designed. And Glennie wrote more about the real lives of gardeners, about, people falling out with people, somebody's plant was bigger than somebody else's plant. And so he did the sort of, the tabloid, if you like, of the day. And he used to gather everybody every year for a big meeting near the Strand, and he would lead the meeting, and everybody again would feast like the florist. So it was traditional of the florist. He was a florist. He was actually a watch case maker from Clerkenwell. In actual fact, that's what he's got his guild membership. But
You use the word florist, but that's not quite the same as we think of the word florist today, is it?
No. So we're talking not cut flowers, although cut flowers were popular, obviously, in Covent Garden being sold. But we're talking about the 8 florist flowers, which include, for example, the dahlia. So Glennie was a florist, and we're talking about sort of urban uses of plants. On a windowsill, you'd have sort of your 8 pots, and you would tend to these lovely little plants that you would be trying to sort of hybridize so that you've got a pinker sort of vein through them, or and the chrysanthemum was another one, trying to make it so it's a different shape at the head of it, and it's tall rather than it's short. And it's a very detailed sort of field of horticulture that was very popular, because you could have your 8 pots and that would be your pride and joy. And those florists would take those and show them and compete who had the best, who had the best beautiful pink, pelargonium and things. And Glennie was an expert at this. He knew how to do that. So he did have the right credentials. He was a gardener, but he also had this newspaper, which was about outrageous. And he was very keen to bring gardeners together in what you could. I mean, this is the days of Chartism. So bringing people together was quite scary for the government, especially bringing 200 horticulturalists together in a pub just off the Strand to suggest that actually their employers weren't looking after them, so we should look after ourselves. We must set up some sort of benevolent association that we all subscribe to, and then that money can be distributed like a friendly society or a benefit society to those that need it. So those elderly, and they used the word indigent, and indigent means poor or needy or really 1 foot away from the workhouse, because by the 1830s we have a workhouse system that is in full swing. And if you couldn't look after yourself, you didn't have an income, there was no state pension, you would be expected to go into the workhouse if your family couldn't look after you. So Glennie was the hero, but there were also other nurserymen that supported him for a bit until he got a bit naughty and started trying to run the association, which wasn't a good idea because he was basically a journalist and a florist. The nurserymen, for example, Mr. Groom of Battersea, Mr. Buchanan, all these other nurserymen gathered together. And the first committee meeting, they created a committee, and the first committee was on the 17th of January 1839, and that's minuted. So we have some beautiful minutes in the archive at Perennial, which show this gathering of all the top nurserymen of the metropolis. Very much started as a sort of a London-centric, and it often got criticised for that, for being a London-centric association. But actually it wasn't, because the Veitches were there. You'd got people coming up from the country, key nurserymen, that felt, again, that this was important. So it was a historic moment, that meeting on the Strand, and then it was fantastic that they then got together as a committee and said, we can do this and we're going to do it. And it took a lot of toing and froing to manage that. Obviously, when you're dealing with people and money, that can create complications. And gardeners had their own businesses to run. These nurserymen had big businesses to run that they had to run as well. So the key thing about the rules, so being Victorian, we're now in the Victorian age because Victoria acceded to the throne 1837. So we're in the Victorian age now, and everything's changing, everything's booming, imports are coming in, the empire is expanding, plants rushing about the countryside to these wonderful estates. And what we have to remember is Victorian institutions needed rules, because there was no real law between a head gardener and his employer. There would be the use of the master and servant legislation, which would mean that you had certain rights as an employee, but really you didn't have many rights. And often a head gardener or a gardening employee would be booted out of his estate cottage and left to go off to his family and find something. So really, there wasn't some sort of employment structure there. So the rules of the association gave gardeners hope that if they put their guinea, and it was a guinea subscription, or they could pay that in instalments, if they put that into that fund, that the committee would look after it, and the committee rotated. So it wasn't always the same committee for years and years and years. It was actually a rotating committee. So you hoped that committee would look after that money and then distribute it fairly. The distribution was really important because they held elections, so you had to be elected. And that was the first thing that sort of was quite complex, in the sense that you had to maybe lobby a few committee members to say, I worked with you on my apprenticeship in 1785 and I'm now sort of 75 and would you mind, and you had to, as a candidate, you had to do multiple things to get a pension. You had to have references from former employees. You had to have a medical certificate. You have to have an address, which often addresses were difficult if you'd just been booted out. So you had to have multiple things. It's a bit like applying for things these days online, trying to get benefits these days. And that's why it's so relevant for today's charity, is the world of aid, mutual aid, is still today difficult to navigate because it's lots of forms, it's lots of verifying who you are, that you are, in need, and in terms of a means testing theory, if you like. So it was tough for them. And their numbers also, because they had to get enough subscribers to create a big enough fund, they had to network. So the gardeners were the best salesmen of the institution. So they would hold flower shows, they'd contribute a bit of a plant sale, they'd do all sorts of activities. And traditionally, the Gardeners' Benevolent has had an annual festival, which is like the feasting of the florists. So it goes right back to there every year. So it has its anniversary dinner. And that was brilliant because it brought everybody together. The nurserymen and the gardeners brought fruit and flowers to decorate. So it must have looked absolutely fantastic. I've got one picture of 1905, which is a fantastic picture, which the orchids were done by James Hudson of Gunnersbury House. And James Hudson, we're talking about 1905, so we've gone right through the century here, but it looks a stunning display of beautiful orchids, which was, of course, those times the fashion of the day. So that was an opportunity for nurserymen to sort of show off what they could do. And they also loved it because, they sang again, there were lots of glees, they had entertainment, they had music, and they had a lovely dinner, and the fruit, of course, for pudding. So what could be better?
Where did they meet? Did they have a regular meeting place in London?
Yes, they did. Yes, so they met at the London Tavern, which, as you know, taverns and meeting places of London, it was a very good. That also moved as time went on and as they sort of established themselves. In 1845, they were registered as a friendly society formally, which gave some protection to them and their funds, as it were, and also gave protection a little bit to the people who applied and the subscribers. But they had huge links to the City of London. So their venues were very much either around the Strand, which was where all the gardening journalists were. So London Tavern, then the first one was held at the Crown and Anchor, which was where the original dinner started. But then they moved along to the Metropole, which doesn't exist anymore. But it's now the Corinthia Hotel, where James Bond, I think they used it in James Bond. It's the most stunning hotel at the bottom of Northumberland Avenue by the Playhouse. And it is a stunning hotel. And that was a sort of usual hotel for sort of 200, 300 people to gather. And they would have a dinner. So they used London venues. In 1852, they used Crystal Palace because, of course, Crystal Palace had moved to Sydenham. And one of their biggest supporters was, of course, in the early days, was not only the nurserymen. They needed a few celebrities. They needed a new celebrity gardeners, as we all do today. Who doesn't need an Alan Titchmarsh when you're in need of getting, trying to get people to give money to your gardening charity? We all love Alan. But in those days, they would love Joseph Paxton. And Joseph Paxton was a busy man, but he also lent support, and he opened his address book for the Gardeners Benevolent, and he actually spoke at, I think it's the 1851, which was his great year because, of course, we had the Crystal Palace in Hyde Park. It was his, and to have a head gardener design one of those iconic buildings, and for gardeners, although actually interestingly it doesn't really contain much gardening equipment, and it has some plants in it, but in its day, but he was a great supporter. And he and the Duke of Devonshire, the original president was actually the Duke of Cambridge, but when he died there was a little shift around, and then the Duke of Devonshire was president for a while until his death. So Paxton was a really important person, but there were other head gardeners who were great supporters. So somebody like Robert Marnock, who designed Sheffield Botanic Gardens, and he also ran Regent's Park for 20 years. He was an enormous supporter because I think he believed that, no one looks after the gardeners, so we have to do it ourselves. There was this sort of feeling that, we are still in this deferential situation, but so we have to collaborate. At the annual dinner, they had, obviously in 1852, they had Charles Dickens, and that was quite fun because I think he was really a sort of speaker for hire. He definitely knew Paxton because Paxton was part of Bradbury and Evans and knew his publisher. There's the connections through all of that press room. But Charles Dickens was a great speaker, but so was Samuel Reynolds Hull in 1872. Now, he was fantastic. He was a Rosarian, a very famous Rosarian, and Bishop of Rochester. And he was a great public speaker, big friend of Thackeray and part of that sort of Victorian kind of literature and romance. And he was always going backwards and forwards to kind of support them. Interestingly, his head gardener got a pension off the Gardeners Benevolent because there are few letters saying, "Oh, you wouldn't just help my head gardener." So there was kind of, there were some exchanges between these great people, but the speakers were fantastic, and there's a whole list of they had the Duke of Westminster, they had the Earl Latham, they had Metchy, who was a great agriculturalist. They had the list is just an alumni of fantastic dukes and things, and they had, so therefore the dukes and the lords and the sort of elite world of amateur gardeners had their uses, if you like, and they performed that role. But they, interestingly, with the Gardeners Benevolent, the gardeners ran it. They didn't ever have a duke actually attending the committee meetings, all the subcommittees, and they also had a very loyal secretary who was called Edwin Cutler. And Edwin Cutler stayed for 50 years as a secretary. And he knew the pensioners and he knew the gardeners and he ran it beautifully. He'd worked in insurance, so he ran it beautifully and sort of was the heart and soul of the administration of it.
What do we know about the beneficiaries? I mean, you paint a wonderful picture of the events and the gatherings, and it's extraordinary. But what do we know about the beneficiaries as well?
Okay, so it's really important, like who got a pension and who could apply. So it is very much not just, because there's a sort of thought, oh, well, it's just to do with head gardeners. Absolutely not. From the start, it was florists, it was seedsmen, it was market gardeners. It was head gardeners, it was foremen too, they could apply. And anybody who'd done, a gardener had to have done 30 years, okay, of service, so it's quite a long time. So you had to be really at the end of your career to get a pension. You could subscribe when you were young, but you basically, and then the other really important community, who obviously is a huge part of gardeners' lives, are their widows. So when a gardener died, the widow, if the gardener had subscribed, and the broad sense of gardener, if they had subscribed and they paid enough payments, the widow could apply for a pension. So there's a whole female body, and only very later in the century do you start to see women gardeners subscribing and getting a pension, which is quite interesting. And you'd expect that with the Victorian age, how it, feminism came through.
So that shows you that shift in dynamics, that shift going on as the women gardeners. That's interesting too.
Yeah. So, and the rules were all important because, again, legislation and things, wasn't sort of there. So market gardeners or seedsmen, they'd have to, as I said, they had to come up to certain criteria, and then they'd have, because sometimes the funds wouldn't be enough. So the poor committee of had to make some really tough decisions, and some of these are quite arbitrary and some of them weren't. So you might get a head gardener who didn't have his medical certificate, so he'd be deferred till the next year. But some, as a chap called Edward Marshall, he applied 13 times. So they'd have elections twice a year to start with. Eventually it became once a year. But he applied 13 times for a pension, and he never quite got enough votes until they said, right, well, we're just going to have to give him a pension because it's 13 years. Okay. I can think of a Brighton gardener called James Smith. He applied 11 times. Now, often they were applying when they literally had a toe in the workhouse. So many didn't. They died before the next election, so they didn't get a pension. But James Smith got a pension for 2 years. And when he died, and this is quite an interesting story, his widow was just 60, and you had to be 60 to get a pension. She was just 60, and she put in her forms, but her medical form was sort of a query. So Mr. Cutler trots down to Brighton, goes and sees whether the local nurseryman, because they use the network of nurserymen and practitioners all the way around the country to find out about these candidates, because they'd obviously got the paper in front of them. But if there was a query, he'd trot off and go and see them. And we've got, we're talking about 1862, we've got railway network, we've got postal network, Britain is starting to be super connected. And he goes down to Brighton, and he comes back and he says to the committee, he says, well, Mr. Sparry, the local nurseryman, he wasn't in, which was like, that's interesting. And I went down to her street. She lived in Hanover Street in Brighton. Well, she wasn't in either. So I've decided that I think we should defer her case, because really I can't, I think she's perfectly capable of earning a living. Now, what I can see as a historian is I can look at the census, and I can see that she's down as an ironer. So she ironed for a living because women would iron because it was piecemeal work. And she was trying to survive while she found out from the committee whether she was going to get a pension or not. from them. So she was working. Her daughter on this census, you can see it again, was a laundress. And of course, you can see that those women are trying to survive. And he will have. And if you look at the other pages of the census, you realise there are 17 laundresses in that street. So it must have been the laundry street of Brighton. And these women are trying to survive because the main breadwinner, James, who probably worked for that nurseryman and probably paid all his subscriptions, he's up to date on his subscriptions, and Cutler has made a snapshot decision and said, I can see she's working. I don't need to help them. And of course, I'd say, well, she's in her 60s, she's yomping mangles and doing a very physical job, just like gardening. Give her a break, give her the money. And so that's really interesting. And other gardeners, the other very, which sounds cruel today, but if somebody was submitted, dementia in its form, however that worked then, I don't know, medically, they would automatically have their pension stopped. They would, once they'd got into that workhouse, that infirmary, the pension, because they were in receipt of parochial relief. So luckily, today's Perennial have buckets of empathy and won't view it in that way. But we are talking about harsh Victorian morals. This is the time of Dickens. It's the time of, the bitterest cry, self-help, thrift. It's about you as an individual preparing for your future. So yes, and as the sort of century marched on, you're getting many more institutional gardener support. So, for example, Bruce Finlay, he's a good example of an institutional head gardener and sort of mover and shaker from Manchester Botanic Gardens. And you can see him networking in, becoming part of the committee. They made a real commitment later on in the century, in the 1880s, to add country members, they call it, to the committee, so that then that network expanded, that they reached out to Kendal and Sunderland and Wales, and because all these places had their own little clubs and things, but then there was a desire to get the word out about the Gardeners Benevolent, because that was the only way to get these networks working, so they could build the subscriptions. But if you think about it, when they started in 1840, they had one pensioner from South London. And then when you're talking about 1908, you're talking about they have over 60 applicants and they're able to give 30 pensions. So what they did at the end, towards the end of the century, because the demand was getting massive, there were more and more pensioners saying, people saying, elderly or widows saying, I really need some help, is they set up two funds. And this was obviously because we're talking about the Victorian age, it's got to be hooked on to some sort of big celebration of kind of Victoriana. So in 1897, you've got Victoria's Jubilee, and they created the Victorian Era Fund. And that was specifically to give short-term relief to gardeners. So those waiting on the list for a pension who couldn't get elected because they couldn't get enough votes, they would be given £5 to keep going, and then they'd stay on the list and they'd sort of jump through. And then they also had something called the Good Samaritan Fund. I mean, it sounds very kind of patronising, but actually it was a way of non-subscribers getting in that queue to see if they could get a pension. And those funds were great. They've also had funds and legacies given to them. So one legacy, they had their first legacy was from Ayton, John Ayton, who was the brother of William Ayton, who ran Kew. And he was a royal gardener, but he gave the first legacy. And thereafter, legacies came in sort of every so often. But, a lot of women gave legacies. So there's this lovely thing that kind of crops up as you march through the century of women who have obviously had a very close relationship with their gardener, a sort of romantic relationship. And these are the amateur gardeners, that remember their old gardener of childhood. And they give money to the Gardeners Benevolent, a legacy or a lovely donation or a subscription to say thank you, because their gardener has meant so much to them, and to their family. So you get a lot of that, and obviously there's lots of famous families that do also give legacies, the Rothschilds, big city players, the Schroders, they give lots of donations, but they have fantastic, famous gardens, with very leading edge kind of techniques and what they were doing. So it was exemplary, and they regarded the charity as being vitally important for the trade, as part of it professionalizing and part of it, having a structure of looking after its own.
As a historian, this must just be fascinating for you.
I think it is because, I went back to FE college and trained as a gardener and a garden designer, and then worked as a gardener and ran my own practice. And then I just thought, what's really weird about, colleges and things, garden college, design colleges or, FE colleges, is they don't teach why we are a nation of gardeners. We are a nation of gardeners, Britain. But where does that all come from? And garden history is, it is a niche subject, but it's a vital part of understanding, the importance of gardening to our country and to our psyche. And I'm very interested as a historian because a lot in garden history is written about, the Duke of Bedford did this and the Duke of Westminster did this and But I'm interested in the people who actually dug the soil and actually, gave their lives to horticulture and put in so much of their skills and their expertise and their lives.
My thanks to Francesca Murray for sharing this fascinating story. The name changed to Perennial in 2003, and the charity is dedicated to looking after people working in horticulture and their families at any stage of life. I'll put a link to their work on the website, where you can also see some of the original documents from the charity's history. You can support this podcast by buying me a coffee on the website, where you'll find all the gardening advice and tips and previous episodes, ourplantstories.com. It's where you'll also find Mona's Corokia and hear the story of how she came to hold a national collection, which was not her original intention. If you have enjoyed this episode, do think about writing a review on your podcast app, as it really helps to share the word about this podcast. Think algorithms and all that. And I pledge, if you do buy me a coffee on the website, I will spend it on the podcast, not plants. Our Plant Stories is presented and produced by me, Sally Flatman. Thank you for listening. If you want to show your support for this podcast via Buy Me a Coffee, then the link is in the show notes or on the website ourplantstories.com. I promise you, your virtual coffee will go towards the podcast, not plants.